Former Vice President Dick Cheney has died at the age of 84. He served as vice president alongside former President George W. Bush, but his political career stretched for decades, making him arguably one of the most recognizable and influential figures in U.S. political history. So let's go live to CBS News chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett. So, Major, we know this. Cheney was polarizing, and even at the end, he was polarizing within his own party, right? I talked to a history professor this morning who told me that he thinks history will see Cheney as one of the most powerful politicians to ever hold office. How does that weigh in what's being talked about in Washington today?
It's undoubtedly true. The vice presidency was powerful before Dick Cheney became vice president. Al Gore helped make that so. He had a very collaborative relationship with President Bill Clinton. But Dick Cheney vastly enlarged the powers that could flow through the vice presidency and into the presidency's office, the Oval Office. He did that by amassing a team around him and working very closely not only with the White House, but expanding his own power on domestic policy first, then after 9/11, dramatically enlarging his role in directing, influencing, and pressurizing the Bush White House to be very aggressive in the war on terror globally, and to advocate both publicly and privately with the intelligence agencies and the rest for the Iraq war. And he did so unapologetically, turning the vice presidency not into an offshoot of the White House, but a central policy-making hive within it. That is Vice President Cheney's legacy within the Bush years. That power created many opportunities for him, many successes, but over time, as public opinion turned very harshly against the Iraq war, ultimately proved to be the undoing of congressional majorities and the Bush presidency.
Yeah, certainly a flashpoint. So those are the earlier and mid chapters as they relate to the White House. But then knowing Cheney was a red meat Republican, he then voted for Kamala Harris over Trump. He called Trump a threat, called him a coward. So how will this last and very anti-Trump chapter shape the legacy of Mr. Cheney?
That's very complicated because there are several dimensions to it. First of all, right now, President Trump is expanding the powers perceived to exist within the presidency, talking about the unitary executive theory of presidential power, Article 2, giving him all sorts of powers that can be somewhat checked by the courts, somewhat checked by Congress, but not really. That unitary executive theory came from Dick Cheney. He pushed that through as vice president during the Bush term and the Bush administration. That's part of his legacy that lives on in the Trump era. Why did he break with President Trump? He voted for him in 2016, but after Trump denied the 2020 election results, Cheney turned away and said he is no longer a figure that lives within the Constitution or an American democracy. He is a demagogue who wants to use demagogic tactics, meaning rallies and the potential threat of violence to overturn a 2020 election, as we saw play out on January 6th. Cheney considered that unforgivable and was implacably hostile to Trump ever after that. And there was also something before that. Remember, when Trump campaigned for the Republican nomination in 2015 and 2016, he was harshly critical of the Iraq war, one of the things that Dick Cheney, as I mentioned a moment ago, helped set in motion. So that was a point of tension that Cheney could live with. But after 2020 and election denialism, he could no longer abide Trump and endorsed and voted for Kamala Harris in 2024.
Well, your legacy of reporting there in our nation's capital goes back many, many years. Is there a memory that sticks out to you as you interacted with the former vice president?
That he was someone who understood not only the levers of power, but he didn't want to explain to people how he was maneuvering those levers in pursuit of the policy outcomes he wanted. Lots of people in Washington come here to tell reporters like me, I'm super powerful, I know where the levers are, I wield all this influence. And sometimes it's true and sometimes it isn't. Rarely do you find someone in Washington who never wants to talk to you about how powerful they are, just wants to exercise the power in their own ways, through their own mechanistic fashions. Dick Cheney fell very much in that latter category. He did not need to be on television. He did not need to be talked about. He did not need to have long profiles written about him, flattering all the ways that he was maneuvering around Washington. He got them occasionally, but he never sought them. What he wanted to do was identify a policy goal and find the best, most efficient way to get there And if that meant doing it behind the scenes, that was perfectly fine with him.
That's why reporters and questions that are major are so important, and it's nice to have you, Major Garrett, one of those question askers, with us today on CBS News 24/7. Thank you.